I've got a few slides on the market, so welcome to everybody. Certainly a surreal and somewhat unreal time over the last 14, 15 months with a global COVID pandemic. But at the same time, I think it's brought healthcare into focus, and particularly the work that we do. So clinical development and drug development has been front and center in society's really response to what has been a really challenging pandemic. I think hopefully we're starting to see an end or a new normal post-COVID, thanks to vaccines and thanks to therapies that colleagues like mine and obviously people on this call have been involved with. I wanted to give you a high-level view of where healthcare is. Healthcare globally makes up about 10% of the total economy, measured by gross domestic product. Within that, the branded pharmaceutical industry that we know makes up about 15% of healthcare. It's an exciting market, as you know. It's growing fairly rapidly, just over 7% on a compound annual growth basis. If you compare that to the total economy globally is growing more in the 2 to 3% range. So the pharmaceutical industry is important. It's going to reach close to $1.4 trillion by the end of 2026, so within the next 5 or 6 years. Exciting in part because I think biology and chemistry and science continues to identify new ways of combating disease. There are novel medicines. We just have to look at mRNA and the response to the COVID pandemic. But in other areas, cell and gene therapy, in rare disease, a lot of exciting research being done that then feeds the clinical development life cycle and ultimately benefiting patients. That's really the business we're in, is can we extend and improve the quality of life for our fellow humans? It's really a mission for the organization, and we put that patient-first focus right across the organization. We started this several years ago. We've invested in a patient-centric approach to developing new therapies, protocol design, the identification of investigators, the outreach to patients, and it's really driving, hopefully, breakthroughs in new therapies. The industry's been extremely busy in the last year responding to COVID, but also managing other clinical trials in other disease areas, and that's actually still the bulk of the business that we do, our competitors do, and our customers do. So maybe the next slide, Kate. So the spend within research and development has been extremely healthy. If you looked at this maybe 10 or 15 years ago, the bulk of this work would have actually been done by large pharmaceutical companies. But what we've really seen in the last sort of 4 or 5 years is a resurgence in the biotech world, in part because the science that's coming out of academia and into biotech, but also the capital and funding that's gone into biotech has seen that group reach really about 1/3 of the total R&D spend in our industry, and it's growing at a faster rate. It's growing at almost double the rate that the large pharmaceutical industry is growing. Now, the two do merge. There's acquisitions and mergers and co-development. There's a lot of exciting stuff going on between biotech and large pharma. What it means for us in our industry is really investments in good, interesting, novel science that hopefully will bring drugs to market. Our role in that is to help accelerate and make that a more efficient, more effective, and higher quality process. So the outlook, certainly for the next 3 or 4 years, and truly beyond that, is pretty exciting. There's a lot of areas of unmet need, as we all know. We certainly have a long way to go to address a number of significant diseases, certainly in the oncology space, the rare disease space as well, but in other chronic disorders as well. There is certainly more opportunity to develop better therapies. Certainly the excitement around some of the newer technologies, particularly cell, gene, and tissue therapies, certainly gives us promise for creating better outcomes for patients. And that should be the mission that drives not just us, but our peers in the industry and our customers as well. Next slide, please. So the CRO world, it's a positive. I think I've been in the industry for 25 years, so it's a pretty long time. But this has probably been as good a time in the market not just for the financial performance and growth of the CRO industry, but really exciting developments, partnering with our customers, partnering with investigators, working with patients. I think the focus that's come about through clinical research, particularly in the COVID environment, where I think society has been focused on obviously the development of new vaccines and therapies, but I think there's a broader awareness of the importance of clinical research and clinical development and the work that we do. There are still significant areas of unmet needs, particularly in the rare disease space. You may be surprised to learn that approximately 1 in 10 people in the US actually live with a rare disease, usually of genetic origin. And the science has advanced to the point that many of these can be targets for future drug development. And we've seen great progress in a number of rare diseases and hope to see more. But it's important we have patients that participate. It's important that we do good work and we engage with the investigator and patient community to help run the clinical trials that demonstrate the safety and efficacy of new therapies. Trials are getting complex. For those of us that were in the industry about 10 or 20 years ago, the number of endpoints, the number of procedures, the number of patient visits that happened in a clinical trial, it's tripled in the last sort of 10 or 15 years. And that's good, but it adds complexity. We now use patient-reported outcomes, quality of life measures, new clinical assessments, patient engagement tools. All of that certainly adds to our work, and we've been able to build a great team, great capabilities, and the training necessarily to run complex global trials. There's an increased demand for outsourcing, not just from the large pharma industry, but particularly from the biotech sector. Many biotechs now have interesting molecules, good science, but small teams, and they need the capabilities at a functional and global level from CROs like Parexel to help bring those new therapies to market. So that makes it an exciting time for us. We are extremely busy as an organization, but I'm glad that we were able to bring some of our colleagues here today to talk about their roles and what we're doing within Parexel to help our customers advance new therapies. Next slide, Kate. You went to it. I'll just cover it quickly before handing over to Sy. Parexel, we are a global organization. People don't realize that we actually have more people in Europe than we have in the Americas, and we actually have more people in Asia than we do in Europe. We move people around our organization, and you're going to hear a little bit about that today. And it's exciting. We've got a patient-first focus. That's been something that's really been the mission and driving the organization. A market-leading presence, particularly in Asia, most particularly China and Japan. A rapidly growing biotech sector. You're going to hear from some of the team. Great regulatory knowledge. Yes, we follow global standards and we follow ICH GCP, but as we all know, the regulations specific to each country can vary around the world, and we have that knowledge and expertise to navigate that environment. And exciting developments in areas like decentralized clinical trials, remote monitoring, risk-based quality monitoring and quality management. Definitely a lot going on, and Parexel is at the forefront of that. Very strong across all therapeutic areas, particularly oncology, immunology, and rare disease. Our Patient Innovation Center gives us real insights to help customers better design protocols and then execute those clinical trials. We're a leader in real-world data and real-world evidence, and that's really driving differentiation in our sector as well. And then great operational tools. We're a private organization. We went private back in 2017. Our investors and our board have allowed us to invest heavily in new systems and new tools, whether that be Viva, Workday, Planisware, which is our project planning and resource platform. So an exciting time, lots of recognition for the team. We are extremely busy, but we're happy you've joined this call, and we're happy to share what's going on within Parexel in the industry. So next slide, and I get to hand over to my colleague, Sy.
Thank you, Jamie. Jamie's section sort of focused on the market overall, and I always enjoy listening to him, and it's also encouraging hearing how well the market is doing and the momentum that there is in our current market. I think that's always reassuring. What I'd like to do in the next section is focus a little bit, sort of bring the focus down from the market perspective that Jamie shared to what's happening in our industry specifically as it relates to the pandemic, which have of course dominated many of the discussions over the last 14 or so months. So speak a little bit about the industry and also what Parexel is doing in that regard. So Kate, if we can go to the next slide, please. Despite all the negative things associated with the pandemic, and I want to be respectful and acknowledge that there were many negative things and that it was very difficult for many people around the globe. But despite that, in our industry, the pandemic has really been a catalyst for the adoption of a lot of innovative approaches that I personally believe needed to happen a long time ago in our industry. So as Jamie alluded to, our industry is tightly regulated and sometimes slow to change. And I certainly believe that the pandemic has helped us in that regard. Let me share sort of our experience on the Parexel side. So pre-COVID, on the left half of this slide, it was really business as usual. And even though we as a company were very focused on innovation and we were sort of driving innovation in the industry, I would say for most part, the adoption of these innovations were very sporadic. And I'll give an example or two in a minute. If you move to the middle of the slide, then the pandemic hit and our world turned upside down, as did everybody else's around the globe. And so for us, the focus really pivoted very aggressively and acutely to ensuring trial continuity. We, at any given point in time here at Parexel, have between about 2,300 to 2,500 active ongoing projects. So how do we keep these going with a global pandemic in the works? So the focus was really on ensuring that we continued to monitor sites as much as possible. And for us to do that and to work with our clients to do that, we had to pivot aggressively to remote monitoring, as did many of our competitors. And to me, it's interesting. So on average, looking at this data, we monitor, we do about 10,000, give or take, monitoring visits per month. And the bulk of those pre-pandemic, of course, were in-person monitoring visits. So during the height of the pandemic, towards the middle of last calendar year, about 70% of those visits pivoted to remote. So very quick pivot, and I think a very efficient and effective pivot to ensuring that we continue to monitor trials as best as possible. Of course, in some countries that was easier than in other countries, but I think overall, we've received a lot of recognition from our clients in terms of how we kept these trials going and how we continued to monitor it. I think the other example in this middle block that I just quickly want to double click on is drug supply. So we had to pivot very quickly and ensure that patients that are unable to get to their sites and sites unable to accommodate patients, that we ensure that they continue to get their drug supply. And we have our own clinical trial supply and logistics organization within Parexel. I think that's a somewhat unique differentiator for Parexel. So at the height of the pandemic, we were shipping drug directly to patients, so not via sites, but directly to the patient's home on behalf of about 600 or so sites that we work with. So I think that's another innovation that the pandemic really brought to the forefront. If I wrap up the slide and move to the right-hand side, you'll see we're of course not post-COVID. COVID is still with us, but I think slowly around the globe, countries are emerging from lockdown. Certainly that's the case here in the US. And our focus here at Parexel has been on what have we learned from the pandemic, what has worked well, and how do we make sure that we internalize those key learnings and that we don't go back to some of the less efficient ways that we did things prior to the pandemic. And we have this Twitter campaign, #NoGoingBack, trying to advocate and to lobby for this. And certainly, as Jamie said, continuing with our laser focus on patients and putting patients first and at the heart of everything that we do, but really investing heavily in approaches like risk-based quality monitoring, which of course includes elements of remote monitoring or centralized monitoring, and really pushing decentralized clinical trials. For me, that's another innovation that I think really benefited from the pandemic. To give you a little bit of context here, we were involved in the very first decentralized clinical trial in 2011, the remote trial, and continued to invest in it because we believed and still believe that it was a great way to reduce patient burden, to bring trials to where the patients are, and also to communities that previously didn't really benefit from clinical trials. But to give you a sense and a data point, pre-pandemic, we probably had a handful of these running. At the moment, we have north of 130 of these running across our organization and across the globe. So something that really took off as a result of the pandemic. I think some of the other things, I'm not going to go through all of them, is the use of data. How do we creatively use data? How do we use data effectively and efficiently to improve the drug development process? And specifically, how do we leverage real-world evidence to complement the evidence that we're gathering during the clinical trial process? So these are some thoughts. There are many more examples that I could cite, but certainly in my view, a very exciting time. As Jamie said, the pandemic has brought our industry very much into the public eye and has driven the adoption of a number of these innovations that I think bodes very, very well for the future. So certainly on my end, I am super excited for what the future holds in our industry. We can move to the next slide, please, Kate. I'm not going to cover all of these, but I am really proud about how of our team and how we pivoted during this pandemic. And we've also received a lot of industry recognition. You can see here, we were voted Best CRO by the Scrip Awards, received kudos from the industry and recognition and acknowledgement from the industry for our efforts in diversity and inclusion. Flexibility, I think that's another key pivot we made internally. So pivoted our entire workforce to working from home, and will likely continue with the bulk of our employees working from home going forward. So making sure we are as flexible as possible while still accommodating our clients and delivering quality service. Also recognized for innovation, I think that's another one. And then also, as I mentioned, diversity and inclusion. So not going to go through all of these, but did want to acknowledge the teams and just call out the fact that I think we're doing very, very well, and that it's a very exciting time to be part of ParExcel. If we go to the last slide, please, Kate. So last slide on my end, maybe taking a little bit of a forward-looking approach, and I'll put a big disclaimer out here. These are my personal views, not necessarily the company's. But I believe, and I think to a large extent as a company, we believe that this explosion of data will continue. To give you a brief example, in the 35 plus years that ParExcel has been in existence, we have collected an enormous amount of data. I think it's north of 160 petabytes. Not that it's important what a petabyte is, and I can't explain what it is either properly. But we recently were asked to bid on a study that used a lot of remote sensors and devices, and the data that would be collected as part of that study is about 80 petabytes. So about half of the data we've collected over 35 years in one single study. To me, that was sort of an aha moment, how the industry is changing, and given the wealth of data, especially big data that we have at our fingertips. And I do believe we'll continue to see that. And certainly, as Jamie mentioned, we continue to invest aggressively in that regard and making sure that we're staying at the cutting edge and that we're being innovative. Of course, it'll continue to be important to know the therapeutic areas, and medical and scientific knowledge will continue to be the basis and the foundation for what we do here. And then another area that I'm really passionate about is the operations side. So how do we sort of make sure that we can operationalize these innovations as quickly and as effectively as possible? And certainly on the ParExcel side, that's been our sweet spot. There are so many smart people in our industry that come up with really cool study designs, platform designs, baskets, umbrellas, but how do we take those concepts and figure out how to operationalize those as quickly as possible? Wrapping up on my end, certainly, once again, personal view, it's a very exciting time in our industry. It's a very exciting time to be at ParExcel. And so if you are considering a career change, please keep us in mind. We'd love to have you on our team. With that, I'm going to pass the podium back to Kate.